Welcome. The history of Western civilization in global perspective covers uh, an amazing span of time and region. And to begin with, looking at this material, looking at Western civilization, we turn to the earliest civilizations. And with this lecture, what I want to do is look at the definition of civilization and also the when, where, why civilization emerged and their major characteristics. And then I want to spend the last bit of the lecture looking at the central force of religion in these earliest civilizations. So we're going to cover a fair bit of time, per se, actually beginning looking back at approximately 3000 BC up to approximately 2000 years later, 2500 years later, but just giving sort of a brief overview of this very important period in Western civilization. I'm going to talk about the concept and sort of physical entity of the West, looking at the major characteristics of civilizations. There's urban life, there's metal weapons, metal tools, there's writing, there's organized government, and looking at the two earliest civilizations, Mesopotamia, and also the civilization that took place in Egypt. And we look at the different groups of people. There's the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and then we will turn to some other people groups: the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Persians. And it is a fascinating topic in the sense of how we see people groups were generally living in isolated areas, rural areas per se, and eventually merge into these cities. Okay, I want to begin with defining civilization. One way to begin a study of the Western civilization in global perspective is to consider the West. The West as representing more than just a geographical area. I mean, we think of north, south, east, west to identify certain locations. But the West is something more than just a physical entity. It is sort of like an idea. And we don't get into it so much in this earlier period, but much later, we have the West having influenced other parts of the world that lie outside what we consider the West. In fact, when we talk about the early civilizations in the sense of trying to get a sense of how Western civilization merged, we really start with the East. An examination of the early civilization is more about the East than the West. So, again, it's often helpful to see the West as a concept rather than solely as a geographical area. So, consequently, civilization is more an idea than a Western civilization is more of an idea than a physical entity. The earliest civilizations began approximately 3000 BC, and this took place in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the Tigris, Euphrates river basins, also identified as the Fertile Crescent. And it is today, of course, we know this region as the part of the Middle East. In world history, these two civilizations, the Egyptian civilization and the Mesopotamian civilization, developed about the same time, again, around 3000 BC. India also actually emerged about the same time. Next was Peru. We won't talk. We're just going to mention Peru just here, but Peru civilization emerged there approximately 2600 BC, and it's 1,000 years later, after the Egyptian and Mesopotamia civilization emerged, that we have the China. We have the civilization take place in China, so approximately 2000 BC. Now, of the early civilizations, the Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans had the greatest impact on Western culture. Now, the Hebrews originating in the East, right? The Middle East, and the Greeks and Romans, they're representing more obviously the West. We're actually not going to talk about the Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans. They'll get much more treatment in future lectures. Now, the word civilization itself is derived from the Latin civita, the city. Usually, urban life is a major component of what we know as civilization. Even when city dwellers often represented only a small portion or percentage of a population of a so-called region or civilization, this small group did dominate political and cultural life. Now, so with the civilization, you have urbanization. You have, again, these larger urban centers. Other characteristics of the early civilizations were the use of metal weapons and tools. So, again, going beyond stone instruments and tools. In addition, a major characteristic of civilization is the emergence of literature, like writing. So you require that. And another major characteristic was organized government. So some kind of infrastructure, some kind of structure, political structure. So if you have all those, you have, in essence, civilizations. Now, regions without city life, without metal tools, literature, and organized government, they just don't meet the criteria of a civilization. But that does not mean they are going to be necessary in that state. We have regions that were isolated that do emerge later as part of civilization. And so we have regions occupied by illiterate tribal peoples. Well, they could and they did advance. And I want to give you one example when we think of ancient Greece. I mean, the ancient Greeks, they had philosophy, they had geometry, they had architecture, but all at the same time when they had this, what was the state of life in Britain? Well, in Britain, the people there had no such knowledge. They were, again, illiterate tribal people. Now, if we compare Greece and Britain much later, say if we refer to at the time of the height of the Industrial Revolution, well, that tells a much different story. Obviously, Britain emerges as a powerful empire when we think of the British Empire in the 19th century. Well, let's get back to our earliest civilizations. I should mention there's no consensus on sort of who came first. Mesopotamia and Egypt, they both emerged about the same period, approximately 3000 BC. But let's just first talk about Mesopotamia. The name Mesopotamia is derived from the Greek meso, in other words, middle, and Potamia. And what is Potamia? Potamia is rivers. So what this means literally is between the rivers. So Mesopotamia, think of between rivers, and those two rivers being the Tigris and Euphrates. Historians face limitations in any study of early civilizations. There is little historical information available, and certainly surviving literature is a rarity. Thus, there is uncertainty even though many methods are used to understand ancient civilizations. For example, scholars use radiocarbon dating for early food production and get some information on food production in its centuries, many centuries ago. Now, I just mentioned this because when we talk about Mesopotamia and Egypt and again any of these early civilizations, there are gaps, but we are able to come to some reasonable, sort of conclusions or suggestions of how life was. It is reasonable to argue that the poor soil and often hostile climate forced the people in the Mesopotamia region to move from scattered homes and villages to larger urban communities. And these larger urban communities, to no surprise, were they emerged along the rivers, of course, being the life force for water, for drinking, and I mean not only just for drinking, but for washing, for transportation. I mean so many uses, right? We need water to survive. As economics historian Thomas Sowell wrote, geography is not egalitarian. So we had disparities that exist due to unfavorable regional conditions. Land with rivers and good soil for agriculture was certainly preferable to dry regions, much like the case is even today. Although, of course, with technology, we can have we can pipe in irrigation and do other things. We can change things that improve the agriculture of regions that are normally would be dry if we didn't have water. So human survival depended on good land. It's pretty obvious, but again, I just want to make the point about why one of the reasons why they see this as being a kind of a push factor for people who are living in scattered rural regions, more desert conditions, who want to have a better standard of living, and thus they make their way to these larger urban centers. Now, the people of Mesopotamia also gathered in urban areas for security reasons. People isolated in rural regions were vulnerable to powerful invaders who were bent on theft or worse. Now, over a period of time, the early cities grew and the outlying communities and villages basically disappear. Looking at the Mesopotamia, we can actually break it down. I mean, there's reference to the Mesopotamians, but we can break it down into two specific groups. They are the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And living in their cities, the Sumerians and Babylonians, they had codes of law. They had their architecture, most of it stone architecture, I should say. They had metal work, and they had elaborate mythologies. Now, as a result of the tough living conditions, the outlook of these people was pessimistic. Yes, cities could offer a better life, and the Fertile Crescent did allow food production, but there were still the floods, the blistering heat, the suffocating dust storms, the torrential rains, and the threat of attacks of tribes. There were the tribes from the north I guess the northern hills, and there was also threat of the invasion tribes in the south from the desert. So in short, there was sort of constant insecurity, and a correlation to this is that the people's understanding of the afterlife was also grim. But I'll return to that theme a little later. Now, moving to the Egyptians. The experience of the Egyptians was better. With the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the geography of the Egyptians was less harsh, particularly the Nile River with its fertile soil. Now, if you think of where Egypt is and where Mesopotamia was, you can see that yes, they actually did share the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Sea was to the north of Egypt, but there the Mediterranean also, the Mesopotamia also came up against the Mediterranean Sea. So you have the Mediterranean Sea to the western border, I guess I could say, part of Mesopotamia. So they both had that connection to the Mediterranean, but Egypt was more compact and also along the Nile, that fertile Nile River Valley. Whereas if you think of the map of how Mesopotamia would extend, further far to the east, and there is also another advantage that the Egyptians had over the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians and the Babylonians, was the fact that the Nile River, it did flood, but the flooding tended to be more gradual and also predictable, more predictable, and much more so than the case with the Mesopotamia region. The Egyptians also had fewer threats of invasion. The following is a hymn, or perhaps you can refer to it as a poem, to the pharaoh at the time. This pharaoh lived approximately 1850 BC, and this is what the hymn states. Quote, "He has come. He has protected the two lands. He has given peace in the two regions. He has come, he has made Egypt to live. He has destroyed its afflictions." End of quote. So what we get from this little piece of literature is the importance of the pharaoh, the king. And it's as a result of this, this sense of good leadership, although as you imagine, the leadership would vary, good and bad, but for the most part, it was good. And as a result of good leadership and the advantage of the Nile being not only fertile for agriculture, but also more, the flooding would not be as damaging as the case with Mesopotamia. These circumstances, according to one historian, contributed to the maintenance for over 2,500 years of the West's most stable, self-sufficient, and static civilization. So historians point to how impressive the Egyptian civilization was, and in the fact that longevity, it being such a stable civilization as long as it was. Now, there are different designations, kingdoms, when we refer to Egypt. So you have the old kingdoms, going back to the very early period, and then you have the middle kingdoms running up to, say approximately 1650 BC. But in these years, if we take a look at from 3000 BC to 1650 BC, it was really quite spectacular. The Egyptians built their magnificent stone pyramids. They also were, worshiping their gods who promised them a prosperous and comfortable afterlife. And the Egyptians at this time, they had a rich and diverse literature. There were wars and internal conflicts. You cannot get away from that. But the Egyptian civilization did demonstrate a richness and stability that was really unmatched in history of the West to that time. Now, I want to say a few words about some other groups. Another notable people were the Hittites. The Hittites were originally Indo-Europeans, those folks that had influences from India and parts of what would be like Eastern Europe for the most part. These Indo-Europeans, these Hittites, they assimilated other cultures into their own. In 1450 BC, they developed in modern-day Turkey. In modern-day Turkey, they had an entire army that served as an assembly and a court of law. And for several centuries, they were a major rival to Egypt. They rivaled control of the Mediterranean with the Egyptians. They, in turn, were overthrown about 1250 BC by mysterious invaders, likely other people from Indo-Europe. These particular invaders had possessed the secret of working iron. Now, in the period after 1000 BC, the Near East was dominated by successively larger and more centralized empires. First, you have the Assyrians, then the Chaldeans, and finally the Persians. All these groups of these people, they united larger areas in this region. Now, the Assyrians were fierce, warlike people who treated their conquered subjects with much cruelty. They used professional armies, and they, having basically learned how to make iron from the Hittites, had superior weapons. Now, the Chaldeans. As for the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar made Babylon the center of his empire, and he was known more as a builder than a conquering warrior king. But he was, a pretty impressive leader. Now, after 500 BC, the Persians controlled the region. They built highways for trade, and they had colossal structures that they built in honor of their rulers. Now, the great conqueror, when we speak of the Persians, was King Cyrus. He was one of the greatest conquerors who ever lived, actually. The Persians, an interesting point about them is they were influenced, their religious thought was influenced through the teachings of Zoroaster. Zoroaster declared that a great judgment day would come in which the God of goodness would triumph over the God of evil and reward his followers with immortality. Okay, this is actually a good transition because I want to talk more about religion. Religion was central in the early civilizations. For example, the Mesopotamians, they worshipped numerous impersonal gods, each of which had a particular responsibility. They possessed human characteristics and personalities. But even if we look at like the mountains, trees, rivers, even like sticks and stones, these were viewed as being alive. They were alive and they had volition. The Sumerians were awed and terrorized by nature. And when again we're referring to the nature, it's just the hostile environment that they faced, eking out their lives. Just think of the, say, desert conditions and the uh, climatic changes that took place, the storms that would roll in different periods in history where you would have considerable climatic um, operations, if I could, maybe not the best way of putting it, but just real difficult periods of times when you have, for example, being very, very hot for a period of time. And of course, I don't want to get into it now, but if we look back in world history, we have climatic change taking place. I mean, later on in my lectures on Western civilization, I'll actually look at the medieval warm period, the climate change that took place back in mostly the 12th and 13th century. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But again, the people were, it could be very difficult. It could be difficult life for them, and they were, they could be terrorized by nature. Well, the people's religious role, and what was in essence was to serve the gods. So that was one of the things that the people, that they believed that they were to serve their gods. Particularly, how did they do that? Well, particularly by offering sacrifices. They would offer sacrifices. And this was all necessary to obtain their gods' goodwill. They wanted their gods to protect them and favor them, so they would have these sacrifices. The historical record is complete, and again, I've mentioned that already, but the scanty allusions to the afterlife in Mesopotamian literature, portrayed as a state of darkness and gloom, really is there's no sense of something better after death. As was the case with other ancient peoples, the Egyptians, so I'm going back talking about the Egyptians, they crowded their lives with gods and spirits. The people believed that immortal beings influence all aspects of nature and human activity, and the Egyptians, they worshiped 80 deities, most of which were associated with life-giving forces of nature. Each city had its own gods, separate from the state gods, and even each family worshipped different gods with whom it felt a connection. And another point about the Egyptians is their belief that their king, their pharaoh, was a god. So Egyptian life also centered on the so-called divinity of their pharaohs. Now, I do have some literature coming out of Mesopotamia, and this, I won't read it in whole, but it kind of sheds some light on how the Mesopotamians perceived death, and it went beyond the grimness, the sadness, the sense of loss when when death comes with someone family member. It went beyond that, because the afterlife, or the sense of what came after, was also grim. So there was no sense of not hope. And here we have, I'll just read a couple passages from each. First is the mother. Now the mother, she is alive, and she's lost her son. And this is how the literature goes. Hark the piping. My heart is piping in the wilderness, where the young man once went free. He is a prisoner now in death's kingdom, lies bound where he once lived. And then if I scroll down, now she is coming to death's kingdom. She is the mother desolate, in a desert place where once he was alive. Now he lies, like a young bull felled to the ground. Into his face she stares, seeing what she has lost. His mother who has lost him to death's kingdom. Oh, the agony she bears, shuddering into the wilderness. She is a mother suffering so much. It is you, she cried to him, but you are changed. The agony she bears, woe to the house and the inner room. So it really is quite a bleak picture. This goes beyond, the grimness of death at the time. There's no sense of hope or ever, being the sense of hope that we get, of course, in Christianity. Here's the son's reply. There can be no answer to her desolate calling. It is echoed in the wilderness, for I cannot answer. Though the grass will shoot from the land, I am not grass. I cannot come to her calling. The waters rise for her. I am not water to come for her wailing. I am not shoots of grass in a dead land. Very bleak. There's no sense of hope. There's no sense of once again reuniting with your loved ones. Now, to conclude the lecture, I just want to go back and again, the point being, when we have civilization, we there's certain criteria that must be met. Urbanization, technological innovation. There is conflict and conquest. There's agriculture. I didn't mention so much. I didn't mention trade or communication, but these are other two aspects that come out of in a civilization. When you have a larger community, there's going to be greater productivity, there's going to be greater creativity, there's going to be things that are going to be surplus, so there's things that can be traded. So in Mesopotamia, you could have trade going on between cities. And also what's important when we look at early civilization is communication. And again, what one sees when one studies world history, whether it be just specifically the Western civilization or more global history, what one sees is that when you have isolation, when you have people who are isolated in groups and away from others, you just don't see the level of innovation and creativity that will take place when you have a larger community, when you have like sharing ideas, like and sort of technologies and things that emerge in, say, a larger group of people, and that makes a significant difference in understanding why some civilizations and some people groups did so much better than other groups, and again referring to disparities in world history. We don't. This much has changed now in our modern world, where those who are isolated are not isolated so much, because we have ways of communication by way of internet and other things that will keep people connected. But back in the day, with the early civilizations, clearly the people who were out in the hinterland, out in the rural areas, it was a much more difficult life for them. Human survival was something quite challenging. So the other thing, the final point I want to make about all this is that the emergence of these Western civilizations, it really did set the how can I put it? Basically, establish the basic structures of what would become Western civilization. So it's a fascinating period. It's something that some historians just love to study because there's a sort of a creativity factor behind it, because there's some gaps, and one can marshal as many different techniques to try to get a sense of what history was back then, but the historical record being incomplete, one has to be creative in a sense to kind of patch things together, and some find that very exciting. Now, more modern historians tend to, feel a little bit more uncomfortable. Feel more comfortable in that they can have access to documentation and lots of it. Obviously, it's an embarrassment of riches when you think of modern history and how much information is out there available for one. But again, the Western civilizations it is a very fascinating period in world history, and in the study of it can be in quite inspiring in one sense of how these people were able to meet the demands of the challenges that they had in life. So anyway, that's a wrap for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.